You remember the moment you first saw it, lying on the windowsill beneath a thin layer of dust. The paper curled slightly at the corners, as though it had been waiting far too long to be touched. The edges softened by time, the faint impression of ink barely visible in the amber light slanting through the old glass panes, as if the sun itself had grown tired of shining there. It had no weight when you lifted it, no promise of urgency left inside its creases, the parchment brittle in your hands, smelling faintly of smoke and lavender, like a letter carried through distant seasons before it finally found you, long after its words could matter. You stood there a while, unsure why the sight of it stirred a heaviness in your chest, the quiet kind that felt older than your own memory, the kind that belonged to another lifetime altogether, a lifetime in which you might have opened it sooner, before the air had grown this still. The room around you breathed dust and faded color, the wooden floor cool beneath your feet, the scent of old books lingering from shelves where spines leaned against each other like weary travelers, every surface marked by the patient passing of years that had slipped through unnoticed. When you unfolded the invitation, the ink was nearly gone, the words fading into pale echoes that seemed to pull away from you, even as you leaned closer, and you had to trace the letters with your fingertips, as though touch alone could recall what sight could no longer hold. The handwriting was elegant but trembling, the flourishes of each letter sweeping like wind across snow. And though the name signed at the bottom felt familiar in some deep and almost forgotten place, you could not tell if you had ever truly known it or only dreamed you had. It was a feast, the letter said, a gathering beneath lantern light and oak beams, a table waiting in a hall where music would spill through the rafters like warmth through winter air. And for a moment you could almost hear it, faint and far away. But the date was blurred into nothingness. The numbers vanished like breath on cold glass, leaving you holding a promise with no shape. A door whose key had been lost to some silent turning of the world when no one was watching. You stepped to the window then, the paper trembling in your hand as the wind moved through the orchard outside, leaves shifting in low whispers that carried the scent of earth and overripe apples, a sweetness laced with the faint ache of something ending. The house had been empty for years, or maybe forever. You were never quite sure, for its corridors seemed to stretch through places that did not belong entirely to the present, each doorway leading into a room where dust floated like pale memory in the stillness. It was the kind of place where time might stop without anyone noticing, where clocks might lose their voices and mirrors might forget to reflect, and the letter belonged to it perfectly, a thing left waiting too long in a house that knew only waiting itself. You imagined, though you could not help it, the night it must have been written, perhaps by candlelight at a desk near the tall window in the hall, the quill moving slowly, the ink glistening before it dried to the soft black now fading beneath your fingers. There might have been music then, you thought, soft strings carried through the corridors, or only the sound of the wind pressing gently against the shutters, as someone wrote the names of guests who would never read the words in time to answer. For the invitation spoke of lanterns that would burn along the long oak table, of bread rising warm from the ovens, of wine deep as garnet resting in the cellar, of voices weaving together in low laughter beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. It spoke of doors opening wide to the night, of carriages arriving along the gravel path, wheels carrying travelers through the last silver of dusk toward a hall filled with warmth and light. All of it waiting behind walls, now empty as a breath held too long. You stood at the threshold of the room, the letter trembling in your hand, and tried to imagine the hall as it might have been, its high ceiling echoing with music and voices, the air rich with the scent of bread and spiced wine and pinewood fire. But the only sound was the shifting of the orchard leaves outside, the soft creak of beams settling in the house above you, and the letter felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of every moment that had slipped past the world it had once belonged to. You wondered if someone had waited there once, sitting at the table while candles burned low, while dishes cooled on silver trays, while the night deepened against the windows and footsteps never came along the road that curved toward the silent gates. Perhaps the feast had ended before it ever began. Perhaps the guests had never known. Perhaps the night had swallowed the music before the first note could rise, leaving only the memory of something that almost was, that almost gathered, before time closed around it. And you thought then of how many things in life are invitations answered too late. How many doors open into rooms already emptied of their voices. How many tables are set for feasts that no one will ever see, the warmth fading before anyone arrives. The letter crumbled slightly in your hand as you folded it again, the crease falling exactly where it must have fallen years ago, and you placed it back upon the windowsill where the dust already began to claim it once more beneath the deepening gold of the light. Outside, the orchard waited in the hush of late afternoon, the fruit heavy and fragrant upon the branches, the sky fading slowly toward evening, and the house around you seemed to settle deeper into itself, as though listening to the soft retreat of day into dusk. You stayed there longer than you meant to, the silence weaving through your thoughts like a slow river, until it was hard to tell if you had found the letter too late, or if it had been waiting for you all along, exactly as it was meant to be. And when you left the room at last, the invitation resting where you had found it, the house seemed to exhale behind you, the orchard turning darker in the wind, the air carrying the faintest trace of music you could almost hear, but not quite. You remember walking toward the hall as evening settled through the windows like slow falling ash, the light outside already thinning into lavender and pale silver, the wind carrying a faint scent of rain that never seemed to arrive. The corridor leading there felt impossibly long, each step sounding softer than the last, upon floors worn smooth by feet that had walked there long before you, the walls holding their breath as though waiting for something they no longer believed would come. When you reached the door, it stood half open, as though someone had left it that way without knowing whether they would return, and the faint glow of candlelight slipped through the gap in long, trembling ribbons across the dusty floor at your feet. You paused before stepping inside, sensing the weight of the air on the other side. A stillness filled with warmth and something else you could not name, something that felt older than the room itself, older than the house, older perhaps than you. The hall was vast, its ceiling stretching high above in oak beams, darkened by time, the walls lined with tall windows whose panes reflected the last bruised streaks of daylight, like tired eyes struggling to stay awake a little longer. Along the center of the room stretched a banquet table so long it seemed to vanish at both ends into the soft glow. A river of wood polished by years of gatherings, now waiting beneath the weight of stillness that had settled upon it. Candles stood like sentinels, along its length, dozens of them, their flames bending faintly in the draught that moved through the room, each wick burning with the quiet determination of something that knew no one was coming but refused to give in to darkness. Their wax had pooled thick upon silver holders, some dripping down in slow folds like the frozen movements of time itself. Pale rivers hardened along the metal stems, as though each flame had been counting hours in its own secret language. You could smell the faint sweetness of beeswax mingling with the dry scent of wood and the cooler breath of stone walls that had watched centuries slip by, their surfaces bearing the marks of hands and winters long gone. The chairs stood waiting along the table, carved from heavy wood, polished by years of use, each one turned slightly toward the next, as if leaning closer for conversation. Though none had felt the weight of a guest in longer than anyone could remember. Silver platters rested untouched at intervals along the table, their surfaces dull beneath a thin skin of dust, as though the memory of food had once lain there, warm and fragrant, before vanishing like voices swallowed by the quiet. You imagined bread, still warm from the oven, the crust carrying the scent of fire and flour. Imagined wine deep and red, catching the light in crystal cups. Imagined fruit glistening in bowls, skins unbroken, sweetness waiting behind color. But the platters were empty, and the cups were dry, and the bowls held only air, and the table stretched on and on beneath the flicker of candles that burned as though for an audience that had lost its way centuries ago. There was music in the room, or rather the memory of it, the faintest echo of strings carried on air that felt too still for sound, as though the walls themselves remembered the last song played there and hummed it softly to themselves. You walked along the table slowly, each step stirring dust from the floor, each movement brushing against air heavy with the scent of extinguished feasts and fading hours. The candlelight bending across your hands like the touch of warm water. The chairs seemed to watch you as you passed, their curved backs carved into shapes of leaves and vines, designs worn soft where fingers had traced them long ago while waiting for courses that would never again be served. At the center of the table stood a great candelabrum, taller than the rest, its branches curling outward like frozen flames themselves, every arm holding a candle that burned as though it had been lit only moments ago, though no one had touched it in years. You leaned closer, studying the soft gold that dripped down its sides, and felt the warmth rise faintly against your face, a fragile warmth that seemed far too small for a hall so large, like a single heartbeat echoing in a sleeping body. The shadows thrown by the flames climbed the walls slowly, brushing against tapestries that still clung there. Their threads faded to the color of old smoke. The patterns of kings and stags and fields blurred into shapes, half swallowed by darkness. Each tapestry stirred faintly in the wind from the windows, as though they too were waiting for footsteps, for voices, for the warmth of people who would look at them again and name the figures they had carried for so long in silence. You stopped near the far end of the table, where the windows rose tallest, and the wind moved most freely through the cracked frames, bringing with it the faint smell of apples from the orchard outside, the fruit already softening beneath its own weight on the ground. The candle flames bent low in the draught but never went out, each one holding to its light with the same quiet persistence the hall itself seemed to hold to memory, as though neither would admit the world outside had forgotten them. You rested your hand on the back of one chair, the wood cool and smooth beneath your fingers, and wondered who had once sat there, whether they had laughed, whether they had leaned forward to tell some story, lost now even to the walls. The hall gave no answer, only the faint crackle of candle wicks and the occasional sigh of the wind between window panes. And you thought how strange it was that places could remember without ever speaking, could hold echoes long after voices were gone. Perhaps the guests had turned back before they reached the gates. Perhaps they had never left their homes at all. Perhaps the invitation had found no one in time. Perhaps the road itself had chosen to carry no footsteps that night. But the candles had burned anyway, one by one, through hours of darkness, until they stood in puddles of their own making. And when morning came, they had burned down to nothing, and the hall had waited in silence for the next night to come, and the next, and the next, until nights became seasons, and seasons became years, and the hall grew thick with dust, but the candles never surrendered, as though someone, somewhere, still believed the guests might arrive after all this time. You turned at last toward the door, the glow of flames stretching long behind you across the floor, and as you stepped out into the corridor again, the light seemed to follow you a little way, spilling through the open door before sinking back inside. The hall returned to its waiting, the candles flickering in a room too large for their warmth, a room holding to its silence, as though silence itself were the only guest who had ever truly belonged there. You remember stepping out from the cool shadow of the hall into air that carried the faintest scent of late summer, the kind of air that felt heavy with ripeness, yet folded gently around you like a slowly closing hand. The path toward the orchard curved along the edge of the field, where the grass had grown tall and uneven, the wind passing through it in low waves, the tips bending like watchers bowing as you walked past in the dimming light. The evening sun lingered low, caught in the branches ahead, where apples hung round and flushed, some deep red like embers, others pale gold like coins forgotten in tall grass, their skins warm with fading sunlight you could almost taste on the air. The trees themselves leaned slightly, as though grown drowsy under the weight of so much fruit, their branches bending toward the ground in gestures that felt weary yet tender, as though offering something that had waited too long to be taken. When you stepped beneath them, the air changed. Cooler here, where leaves shifted above like fragments of a green sky, the light filtering down in broken pieces that slipped across your shoulders like the touch of someone passing slowly behind you. The scent wrapped around you first, sweet and faintly bruised, apples ripening past perfection, so their skins carried a softness now, the fragrance of sugar turning toward cider and earth, the quiet promise of sweetness dissolving into something darker beneath it. You stopped to pick one, though you knew you would not eat it, the skin warm and smooth against your palm, a single leaf still clinging to its stem, trembling slightly in the breath of wind that moved through the branches above. Its weight was nothing, yet somehow you felt it belonged to another time, to another gathering when hands had reached for it before laughter rose along the orchard's edge, before baskets filled and tables waited in the glow of lantern light. But no one had come this year or the year before, and perhaps not for many years at all, so the branches bent lower each season, carrying more than they could hold, until the wind began to shake loose what time could not. Beneath the trees the ground was soft with fallen fruit, some whole and shining in the last of the sun, others split where they had landed, their sweetness seeping into the soil. drawing slow circles of bees, humming lazily over the bruised skins. You could hear them moving in the stillness, a faint droning like distant strings, their small bodies drifting from apple to apple as though gathering music rather than nectar, as though the air itself were a song they carried away in pieces. The grass brushed against your knees as you moved between the trees, its blades cool with evening, even as the air above held the last warmth of day, the scent of apples and earth rising thicker where the wind turned slowest. At the center of the orchard stood an older tree whose branches curled wide like open arms, the trunk twisted with years, yet holding itself against the sky, as though unwilling to fall while there was still fruit to carry each season. You rested your hand against its bark, rough and ridged beneath your fingertips, the warmth of the sun lingering faintly in the wood, though shadows had already begun to gather at its roots, where the grass lay trampled by no one's footsteps. Above you the apples glowed faintly in the fading light, small lanterns strung through the leaves, each one turning slowly in the wind, as though watching the last colors drain from the sky. Before the night rose over the hills beyond, you wondered how many harvests had come and gone here without hands to claim them. How many summers had offered this sweetness only to let it fall back into the soil, feeding the same roots that would bear it again and again. Perhaps the first guests had planned to gather here before the feast, to fill baskets with the brightest fruit, to carry it laughing through the path toward the hall where candles would wait for the color and fragrance they brought inside. But the baskets had never arrived, and the tables had stayed bare, and the orchard kept growing, as though unaware, as though convinced someone would come next year, or the year after, or whenever the wind carried voices back through the branches. The leaves above whispered as you stood there, a sound like pages turning slowly, like someone reading a story too softly to hear the words, the syllables dissolving into air before they ever reached the edge of meaning. You closed your eyes and listened until it was hard to tell whether the orchard was speaking or only breathing, whether the wind moved through the leaves or the leaves moved through the wind, both shaping a music too old for words to follow. When you opened them again, the sky had deepened toward violet, the first pale stars trembling faintly above the treetops, where apples still burned with the last gold light, small suns refusing to surrender even as darkness climbed the air. You carried the single apple a little while before setting it gently in the grass at the edge of the path, where it shone dimly beside the others that had fallen there, waiting to soften into earth as all fruit must in time. And you thought then of how sweetness fades whether someone tastes it or not, how trees keep offering what no one comes to take, how the air grows heavy with ripeness before carrying it all back into silence again. The bees circled slower now, the wind turning cooler through the branches, the ground beneath your feet soft with shadows gathering at the base of every tree, darkness rising as though the orchard itself were exhaling into the approaching night. You walked back along the path slowly, the grass folding behind you, the scent of apples drifting after like a memory that would not quite follow all the way home, a sweetness that lingered only at the edge of the air. The trees closed behind you without moving, their branches holding the last light above the fallen fruit, and the orchard waited once more in the stillness, offering its sweetness to no one as the stars began to appear between its leaves. And when you glanced back one last time, the apples seemed to glow faintly, in the darkness, as though keeping some small promise to the night itself, a promise older than harvests, older than guests, older even than the feast that never came. You remember the room where the musicians should have been waiting, the air carrying faint traces of varnished wood and quiet dust. The doors open as though someone had meant to return but never quite reached the threshold again. The chairs were still there, arranged in a half-circle near the tall windows, their backs carved into slender curves, each one facing the music stands that held no sheets, as though the notes themselves had forgotten how to find the page. The light fell unevenly through the glass above them, long rectangles of golden shadow touching the floor like steps toward a stage that had waited too long for its audience, too long for the hands that would wake it again. A harp leaned in the corner near the wall, its strings unbroken but pale with dust. The wood warm beneath the sunlight, though the air carried a coolness you could feel even from across the room, like a breath left unsent. Beside it, a cello rested against its case, the bow laid carefully along the top, as though someone had set it there moments before stepping out, intending to return before the air itself grew thick with waiting. On the table near the door lay a scatter of rosin dust beside a cloth stiffened with age, its edges curling like leaves in autumn, the faintest scent of pine rising from it when the wind stirred through the open window. You stepped closer, your footsteps muffled against the wooden floor where the light shifted like water, the boards worn smooth by years of shoes and echoes, by the movements of players now gone so long the walls seemed to carry their silence. The piano stood closed near the hearth, its keys hidden beneath a lid that bore the faint marks of hands resting there during pauses between songs. The wood cool beneath your fingers when you traced the pattern worn by time. You could almost hear them, though, as though memory itself hummed softly inside the room, as though the air still carried fragments of rehearsal or laughter. The warm drone of strings, tuning while someone tapped gently at the ivory keys. The chairs felt heavier than they looked when you brushed against one, the wood polished by hands that had lifted it too many times to count, moving it closer to the circle when the nights turned long and the fire too low. You imagined the lanterns hanging above them, the way their flames might have swayed with each gust of wind from the windows, throwing the musicians into gold and shadow as they leaned toward the first note of an evening that never came. Outside, the orchard swayed beneath a fading sky, the branches moving in rhythms too slow for song, the wind carrying scents of apples and dust through the windows where it stirred the curtains into shapes that folded like wings around the glass. Someone had polished the instruments once, you thought. Someone had tuned the strings and warmed their fingers near the hearth. Someone had carried sheet music under one arm as though holding words. The air itself was waiting to speak aloud. But the pages had vanished now, and the strings stayed silent, and the bows lay resting against their cases as though frozen mid-movement. A single breath suspended too long until even the dust began to weigh upon it. You stood near the window then, the wind pressing gently against your shoulder, the sunlight stretching long across the floor toward the center where the musicians would have gathered, and you could almost see them there if you closed your eyes. The violinist tapping his foot softly while tuning his strings, the flutist warming the mouthpiece with quick silver breaths, the cellist leaning into the curve of the wood, as though the instrument itself were alive beneath their hands. Perhaps they had been invited, perhaps they had prepared their music, Perhaps they had traveled roads lined with lanterns toward the hall where the feast was waiting. The tables set, the guests gathering, the air ready to be filled with song. But something had turned them back, or held them elsewhere, or perhaps only time itself had stepped between them and the hall, leaving the room waiting through one evening after another, until years gathered like dust in the corners. The instruments aged quietly through it all, their strings loosening in the cool nights, their wood deepening in color where the sun touched it through the same windows, again and again, the seasons turning outside without footsteps to follow them in. You wondered if music lingered longer than people, if melodies could hang in the air long after the players were gone, weaving themselves into the beams overhead where swallows nested now, carrying the faint hum of songs no one remembered. The harp leaned patiently against its wall, its curved frame holding light in the same way water holds sky, each string trembling faintly whenever the wind pushed the door wider, as though a single note wished to be heard after all. But no one answered, and the room held its silence, as though cradling something too delicate to release. The instruments gathered like figures in conversation who had run out of words and now only listened to the sound of the air. The floor creaked softly when you moved again, each step stirring dust that rose like pale smoke before falling back into the boards, settling slowly in the same paths where shoes had once walked toward chairs no one carried away again. Even the fireplace seemed to wait for someone to kneel before it, to stack wood carefully and stir warmth into the air so the musicians could rest there between songs, speaking softly while the night deepened against the windows. But the hearth stayed cold, and the room stayed still, and the instruments leaned quietly against their own silence, as though they had made peace with it long ago, as though they no longer expected the sound of footsteps in the hall. You touched the edge of the piano before leaving, your hand brushing the smooth lid where sunlight lay thin as dust itself, and you thought of keys waiting beneath it like teeth behind closed lips, holding back songs no one asked for anymore. When you stepped into the corridor, the air felt heavier behind you, as though the room had drawn the door slowly closed, the wind slipping through the windows one last time before the curtains fell still against the frame. And as you walked away, you imagined the musicians returning someday, sitting in the same circle, the same chairs, the same light falling across their shoulders, as though no years had passed between the first note and the last silence. You remember the kitchen most clearly by its warmth, though the fires had long since faded when you stepped across its threshold, the air carrying only the faint trace of smoke that clung like a memory to the stone walls. The great hearth dominated the far side, its opening blackened by years of flame, the iron racks inside cold and gray now, their surfaces dusted with the same pale ash that drifted like ghostly snow across the flagstone floor beneath your feet. Copper pots hung above the counters in uneven rows, their once bright surfaces dulled by time into soft brown shades that caught the sunlight slanting through the high windows, the light turning them briefly gold, before shadows climbed back over their faces. The long wooden table at the center stood scarred by knives and stained by years of herbs and fruit, its grain polished smooth where hands had kneaded dough, where spoons had rested, where steam had once risen in the heavy air. You could still smell it faintly, the sweetness of bread baking slowly, the sharpness of onions and pepper, the dark warmth of meat roasting while the fire hissed beneath dripping fat. each scent threading through the air like quiet voices overlapping in conversation. Near the hearth, a stack of firewood leaned patiently against the wall, the logs pale where the axe had split them, their edges catching the light like thin bones, though no hand had reached for them through too many winters to count. The oven doors stood open, iron mouths waiting for loaves that never came, their interiors blackened by old heat but carrying only dust now, as though they had swallowed every flame long ago and kept only its shadow behind their hinges. You ran your fingers along the edge of the table. The wood cool beneath your touch, despite the warmth that seemed to cling faintly to the room, a warmth that belonged less to the air than to memory itself. In the corners, baskets sat where someone had left them, still holding scraps of linen stiffened by time, a few kernels of grain hardened to stone, the remains of what might have been a meal before years settled over everything like snow. The windows above the sink let in narrow beams of light where dust floated slowly, each particle turning gold before vanishing back into shadow, as though the air carried its own secret harvest long after hands had left it untended. You imagined cooks moving through the space, sleeves rolled back, knives flashing through onions, steam rising from kettles while voices rose with it, the clatter of spoons and pans blending into a music entirely different from the one the musicians never played. Perhaps they had prepared the meal once, you thought. Perhaps the bread had risen beneath cloth, the stews had simmered through hours while the sky darkened outside, each dish waiting for footsteps that never crossed the threshold into the hall. The fire would have burned bright then, scattering sparks against the chimney walls, its glow flickering across faces bent over cutting boards, faces carrying the same light in their eyes when laughter drifted like flour through the dim air above the counters. But no one had returned to clear the ashes, to scrub the pots, to carry bread warm as breath into the waiting hall, and the fires had dwindled night after night, until only embers glowed faintly like eyes closing slowly in sleep. The shelves still held jars along their crooked boards, jars clouded with age, their glass smudged, their labels curled and pale, as though even the ink had grown tired, though faint shapes of herbs and peppercorns still clung inside like shadows of seasons. A single ladle rested beside the sink, its handle worn smooth, its bowl holding dust instead of broth, and you wondered how many winters it had lifted stew from the pot before the air forgot the scent of onions and thyme. The flagstones under your feet felt uneven but familiar, their surfaces carrying the memory of footsteps, of spills long scrubbed away, of chairs dragged back when the night grew long and someone lingered beside the fire with bread still warm in their hands. You leaned against the doorframe after a while, watching the way sunlight fell across the hearth, the light shifting slowly as though tasting the room, sliding across the racks where iron hooks held nothing now but the smell of old smoke. The air seemed to hum faintly, though perhaps it was only the wind through the chimney, a low whisper winding down through the bricks as though searching for embers long since cooled to pale gray beneath the open iron grate. On the table someone had left a cutting board marked by years of knives, its surface scarred into maps no one could read now, each line a river cut through wood by hands that never thought of leaving it behind. A few withered herbs still hung from the rafters where hooks had once carried fragrant bundles, leaves now curled into brittle knots that stirred faintly whenever the wind pressed through. The broken pane above the windowsill and moved through the rafters like breath. The warmth you felt there seemed older than fire, older even than the room, as though it had seeped into the walls from every meal cooked across centuries, refusing to leave even when the doors had stayed closed for decades. You thought of bread cooling slowly on the table, while servants carried platters toward the hall, while lanterns glowed along the long table where guests would gather, the warmth of the kitchen traveling with each dish through the dim corridors. But the platters never left, and the bread hardened where it cooled, and the hearth swallowed its own flames night by night, until the room learned to live without footsteps, learned to hold its warmth inside stone instead of air. When you crossed to the hearth and knelt there, the cold ash shifted beneath your touch, fine as powder, clinging faintly to your fingertips, the way flour might cling before it became bread, before it carried sweetness into the waiting hall. You let it fall slowly back into the grate, watching the pale dust scatter like smoke, sinking instead of rising, like breath returning to stone rather than escaping it. The air holding the gesture as though recognizing something it had seen before. Perhaps the fires would burn again some day, you thought, though the logs would be new, the hands different, the air carrying another century's warmth, while the walls remembered every flame the same way they remembered footsteps and voices, now long gone. The kitchen seemed to listen as you stood there, the pots above the counters catching the last of the light, the herbs trembling faintly on their hooks, the wind moving carefully through the chimney before fading toward silence once more. And when you left, the door falling closed behind you, the room held its warmth the way a shell holds the sound of the sea, as though waiting for someone to hear what had already passed into memory. You left the quiet kitchen behind and found yourself beneath the open sky, the air cool against your face as the evening light pooled like old honey along the edges of the road, stretching pale and narrow into the distance. The path carried the faint memory of wheels and hooves, though no sound reached you now, only the whisper of wind moving through dry grass at its borders, the stems brushing one another softly as though exchanging secrets too faint to keep. Shadows lengthened slowly across the fields on either side, long ribbons falling from low trees whose branches carried the gold of late sunlight along their upper leaves, while their roots disappeared into darkness like hands folded beneath blankets of soil. The dust beneath your feet lifted faintly when you walked, rising in thin veils that drifted back to earth with no hurry at all, leaving the air tasting faintly of clay and old rain, though the sky above carried no clouds. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, a single note dropping gently through the evening like a pebble into deep water, its echo stretching thin before silence rose again and folded the fields back into their stillness like closing hands. The road itself felt older than the walls you had left behind, its curves bending as though shaped by centuries of footsteps, long before any hall rose to invite them toward firelight and wine and the music of flutes in the rafters. You could almost see them, if you wish, carts laden with fruit and casks of dark wine, travelers wrapped in cloaks against wind or rain, horses snorting softly while bells tied to their bridles chimed faintly like tiny voices calling one another home. But no carts waited now, no bells sang, no figures drifted forward along the fading road. Only the evening wind moved there, stirring the dust, carrying the faint scent of hay and water where the fields dipped toward a forgotten stream. You walked slowly, as though listening for something the air had promised but not yet given, some trace of laughter or song. But the silence remained, deep and soft as wool wrapped around the world, until even memory grew quiet. Along the roadside, a broken fence leaned heavily toward the grass, as though tired of standing, its rails silvered by years of sun and rain. Nails rusted into deep orange blooms, where the wood split like bread left too long in heat. A single gate still clung to its hinges there, swinging faintly whenever the wind gathered, its squeal thin but low, like a voice speaking through sleep, though no one passed beneath its arch and no animals moved in the shadowed field beyond. You thought of the guests who never arrived, wondered if their wagons had rolled somewhere along this road before stopping, if footsteps had turned back before reaching the gates, if voices had fallen silent long before the feast could begin at all. The sky above deepened slowly toward violet, stars gathering faintly in its higher reaches, though the horizon still burned with the last gold of sun. That narrow band of warmth stretched thin, as though the day itself were reluctant to leave. You remembered how the road curved beyond sight just ahead, bending gently toward the distant hills, and you wondered if the guests had waited there for some signal, some lantern, some sound of welcome that never crossed the cooling fields toward them. Perhaps they had stood beneath the trees there, you thought, shifting slowly from foot to foot as evening gathered, the horses lowering their heads toward dry grass, the wind lifting cloaks lightly as though reminding them how far the night could reach. The dust along the road carried no prints now, only the faint ridges left by rain long ago. Water carving its slow paths downward until the sun returned and hardened them, leaving the surface cracked like a dry riverbed beneath your shoes. You knelt once to touch it, the earth faintly warm where the day's last light lingered, its grains sliding soft and loose between your fingers before the wind scattered them. Back across the road, as though erasing even your own presence there. Somewhere behind you, the walls of the hall rose faintly above the fields, the roofs turning dark against the last light, while crows settled along the ridges, their wings folding slowly, as though they too listened for footsteps that never came again. The air changed slightly as you walked farther, carrying the cool scent of water from where the land dipped, the smell soft and green after the dry dust, the kind of scent that drifts across miles when evening winds begin to wander. Down in the hollow, you found the stream moving quietly between stones, its surface holding the reflection of the first stars. The water slipping around moss and roots with a sound like whispers, meant only for those who paused long enough to hear. You thought perhaps the guests had crossed there once, their wheels leaving grooves along the soft banks, but the grass had grown high where the mud had been, each blade swaying slowly now, as though the wind read from a script it never finished. The bridge above the stream leaned slightly where its beams had settled, the wood darkened by rain and time, its handrails polished smooth by hands that had crossed year after year until no one came, until the boards learned only wind and silence. You stood there a long while, the air cooling against your face, while frogs called softly from somewhere under the banks, their voices rising like small bells ringing at the edge of sleep before falling silent again when the wind passed overhead. Beyond the bridge, the road climbed gently toward the hills where the first night birds had begun to circle, their wings cutting slow shapes against the deepening sky, as though writing messages the fading light would never carry far enough to read. The grass along the edges leaned after them, each blade sighing faintly when the wind moved through. The sound almost like footsteps in deep leaves, almost like the echo of travelers climbing toward the gates before turning slowly back into darkness. You imagined them pausing here, where the road bent higher, their lanterns glowing faintly against the trees, the air smelling of smoke and horses and bread still warm inside the carts, while they waited for something that never reached the hills at all. Perhaps the night rose too quickly, you thought, the stars gathering above them before any signal came, the fields turning silver with dew, while the torches along the walls stayed unlit, leaving the road to darken until even the horses stopped moving. The hills beyond held only wind now, only the slow call of owls drifting through the trees where moss shone faintly on fallen trunks, the ground soft beneath years of leaves that carried the smell of rain even when the air stayed dry. You followed the road only a little farther before stopping where the grass grew high along its edge, the stalks brushing softly against your knees, while fireflies drifted upward from the shadows, like sparks remembering a fire no one had kept alive. The air cooled there in a way that felt final somehow, like the closing of a book or the last chord of music fading against stone walls, leaving only silence to wander slowly across the dust where footsteps had once promised arrival. And when you turned back toward the gates far behind, the road lay empty under the stars, the bridge and stream and fields holding only wind now, as though everything had been waiting for a century longer than anyone ever returned to count. You remember stepping into the great hall, the air still carrying faint traces of past gatherings, the stone walls cool beneath your fingertips, their surfaces echoing with sounds that never fully reached the present, like whispers caught in quiet sleep. The windows were tall and arched, pale light spilling through them in fractured columns, each one touching the floor like thin ribbons of silver, as though the sun itself had come late and lingered only to leave again. The floorboards beneath your feet were smooth in some places and worn deep in others, holding the memory of countless steps, the rhythm of shoes brushing against wood, the faint pulse of movement that had once filled the hall from end to end. A great chandelier hung above, still suspended, though its candles remained unlit, its brass frame darkened slightly with age, each crystal prism catching the light in tiny tremors, as though trying to remember the warmth of flames it had once held. Along the walls, tapestries swayed faintly in the breeze from open doors, their patterns softened by years, the threads curling into shapes half recognizable, animals and flowers turning slowly in the shadowed light, like figures in a dream just beyond recollection. You could smell faintly the mingling scents of polished wood, old stone, and a hint of wax, a delicate perfume of memory clinging to air that had long since stopped carrying voices, or the laughter of guests gathering for a feast. The long tables lay empty, polished smooth, their surfaces reflecting the last gleam of sunlight from the windows above, the chairs tucked beneath them as though waiting for hands that would never come to rest in their carved curves. At the far end, a small platform rose slightly from the floor, the place where musicians would have played, yet no instruments rested there. No sheet music fluttered, only the cool air holding the echoes of songs that were never sung for anyone at all. The hall seemed to breathe softly, a rhythm almost imperceptible, like the rise and fall of a slow tide. carrying with it the memory of conversations that had never happened, of music that hovered just beyond reach, waiting in the wings of time. You imagined a harp, strings gleaming faintly, though none had been strung, a violin poised in memory alone, the bow hovering in air as though a hand had left it mid-motion, the sound of notes imagined more vivid than silence itself. The ceiling stretched high above, beams darkened by centuries, the space between them holding shadows that moved gently with the wind, the light catching the edges of stone arches, making them seem soft and warm like folds of cloth laid carefully across the hall. Somewhere in the distance, the orchard whispered to the hall, its trees brushing together faintly, the wind carrying the scent of apples and earth through the open doors. A faint promise of sweetness that could never reach the polished tables set in silence. You ran your hand along the edge of one chair, the wood cool beneath your fingers, worn smooth by hands that had never touched it, each groove and curve telling stories you could not name, memories folded into shape beneath your touch. The air seemed to hold on to the faintest vibration, like the hum of a chord waiting to be struck. The silence waited but not oppressive, carrying instead the gentle ache of anticipation that had lingered longer than anyone could remember. Perhaps the guests had come near once, you thought, their footsteps brushing the floorboards lightly before turning back, leaving the hall empty but still alive with potential, a room that had learned to wait for music that never arrived. Candles along the walls remained unlit, their wicks stiff and pale, yet the memory of flame hung in the air like a subtle warmth, brushing against your skin as though someone had once passed by with a lantern, soft and deliberate, leaving behind only light remembered. You imagined chairs pulled back, bows lifted, instruments poised to vibrate under fingers, the first notes rising in soft arcs through the air, but then fading before they began, the hall holding its breath as though it knew it must wait a little longer. The floor felt alive beneath your steps, though no one else was present, each creak of wood a soft echo of voices and laughter that had never come, a gentle rhythm that carried you slowly across the expanse toward the far doors and beyond. The wind shifted through the open windows, carrying with it the faintest scent of firewood and evening dew from the fields outside, brushing over the tables, sliding across the floor, stirring a tapestry here and there. And you imagined it as the first measure of a melody long forgotten. You lingered near the center of the hall, letting the light fall across your shoulders, tracing the carved edges of chairs, the long sweep of empty tables, the faint curves of arches that had once framed movement, now frozen in gentle repose. The echoes of music were not loud, not insistent, but soft as if breathing under the floorboards, threading through the air like threads of silver light, carrying with it the memory of an audience that had never arrived and the promise of notes that never played. And as you turned to leave, the hall seemed to exhale softly, the faintest creak of floorboards, the shimmer of light through glass, the sigh of the wind across the tapestries, each movement reminding you that the space remembered everything, even what had never been. You step into the garden as evening settles, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of late blossoms and damp earth, each step stirring the faint rustle of leaves that have learned to move without sound. The lanterns hang along the winding paths, their glass dimmed by dust and age, faint traces of orange light lingering like echoes of fireflies long vanished. soft reflections tracing gentle patterns across the grass and worn stone. The flowers lean toward the fading light, their petals soft and trembling, carrying the delicate sweetness of roses and lilies mixed with the sharp tang of herbs pressed against sun-warmed soil, a scent that drifts over your skin like memory itself. The cobblestone paths are uneven beneath your feet, each stone cool from the night air, worn smooth by countless shoes that never walked here. And yet the garden feels alive with the possibility of footsteps that might have come long ago. A fountain stands at the center, its waters still and glassy, reflecting the slow drift of clouds across a violet sky. The gentle scent of moss clinging to its stone edges, carrying a subtle promise of rain yet to fall. The benches along the edges are empty, their wood softened by wind and sun, their iron arms cool to the touch, the spaces around them carrying the faintest impression of laughter and conversation that had never been spoken aloud beneath these branches. You brush against the leaves of a small tree, its branches low and pliant, the soft scrape of bark against your fingers, releasing a whisper of sap and earth, a quiet sweetness that lingers in the air long after your hand moves away. The lanterns sway faintly with a breeze that curls between the hedges, their shadows stretching across the paths like faint fingers tracing a slow pattern over stone and grass, reaching for something that will never return to the garden at all. A single bench under a willow offers shade and quiet, the drooping branches brushing your shoulder as you pass, their rustle soft as silk against skin, the scent of damp wood and leaves rising gently in the cool evening air. You notice a bird perched along the top of the hedge, its feathers catching the last sliver of sunlight, the sound of its wings shifting against each other, a soft, almost musical note in the otherwise still air of the garden. Along the edges, small herb beds have grown wild, thyme and sage tangled with the grass, their aroma strong and earthy, the fragrance lifting as the wind drifts through, carrying it like a message from seasons that have come and gone unnoticed. The fountain's surface trembles faintly as though a pebble had fallen. Though no sound reaches you, the movement reflected in the lantern glass, a ripple of memory tracing shapes in the water that never quite form, lingering like a song that fades before it begins. You walk slowly along the winding paths, your fingers brushing against hedges shaped long ago, their leaves rough in some places, soft in others, the contrast carrying the sensation of touch that stretches across years, across nights, and quiet afternoons alike. Perhaps the guests had walked here once, their laughter trailing behind like wind through the branches, lanterns swaying as they moved, their steps careful across cobblestones and grass, carrying the faint scent of candles, wine, and perfume that mingled with roses and herbs. But no footsteps mark the paths now, only the impressions of seasons passing, the soft indentations of rain in the soil, the slow curves of wind along stone, a garden that has learned to breathe quietly without needing anyone to move through it. A small archway carries the scent of honeysuckle and jasmine, vines twisting upward and over stone, petals catching the last of the sun in soft blush tones, the air rich with fragrance that seems to linger longer than any light or warmth remaining in the evening. The lanterns glow faintly only where the last sunlight kisses them, their warmth imagined rather than real. Small flames that might have flickered in another time, their glow tracing delicate patterns across the grass, as though reminding the garden of its own quiet beauty. You kneel briefly by the fountain, letting your hand skim the cool surface, feeling the faint ripple against your palm, the water smooth, yet carrying a texture older than your memory, as though every season has left a gentle mark in its depth. The air carries the faintest song of insects, crickets hidden in the hedges, their soft choruses rising slowly like a lullaby, blending with the distant rustle of leaves, a gentle music only the night and your presence can witness in full silence. The benches remain empty, the paths untrodden, the lanterns unlit, yet the garden does not feel abandoned, only waiting, breathing quietly, as it always has, its colors deepening in the soft shadows, its fragrances lingering like a hand pressed against your cheek in a memory you cannot forget. You walk slowly back toward the entrance, brushing your fingers along the rough stone of the walls, the lanterns swinging faintly in the breeze, the scent of flowers trailing you like a soft reminder that some things are preserved even without company or sound. The sky above deepens into violet and indigo, stars gathering faintly along its curve, the garden folded gently beneath them, the lanterns glowing faintly with imagined flame, each one a memory that rises and settles slowly with the night. And when you turn away, the garden holds its quiet, the scent of flowers lingering in the cool air, the paths waiting for footsteps that will not come, the lanterns suspended above a world that remembers even those who never arrive. You step into the long corridor, the air cool and carrying the faint scent of polished wood and distant hearth smoke, each footfall echoing softly against the walls like whispers of guests who had intended to arrive. The paintings along the walls are dim with age, their colors softened and edges curling, the brush strokes blurred in a way that makes the figures seem to move subtly, as though breathing quietly behind glass and time itself. Carved molding runs along the base of the walls, smooth beneath your fingertips, each curve worn by hands and shoes that have passed over centuries, carrying faint impressions of footsteps that linger more in memory than in the present. The carpet beneath your feet is faded, the rich reds and golds softened to pale warmth, the fibers pressing gently against your shoes, absorbing the sound of your steps while holding the echo of others who never reached the hall. A breeze drifts through the open windows at the corridor's end, carrying scents of lavender, damp stone, and evening air, stirring curtains slightly, brushing your cheek with faint coolness, like a hand reaching across decades to remind you the corridor remembers. The doors that line the hallway are closed, each one heavy, their hinges darkened with age, the polished brass knobs cold beneath your fingers, as though they too have held back voices and footsteps, keeping secrets folded quietly behind their surfaces. You imagine servants hurrying past, trays balanced carefully, lanterns glowing faintly in their hands, their footsteps precise and swift, the air heavy with anticipation of a feast that never arrives, leaving only the echo of absence along the polished floor. Somewhere far off, a clock ticks slowly, though its sound is faint and uneven, carrying the rhythm of hours stretching endlessly, the soft passage of time blending with your own heartbeat as the corridor folds quietly around your presence. The light falls in narrow columns from tall windows, touching patches of carpet and wood, the dust floating in the shafts illuminated like golden threads, a lattice of memory hanging between shadow and light, as if the corridor itself is breathing softly. You pause to rest your hand against a wall, feeling the faint warmth of sun carried through the stone, a gentle reminder that the world outside continues, even while the hall and corridor hold still, suspended between memory and absence. The paintings seem to lean toward you slightly, their eyes faintly tracking your movement, as though they remember every guest who never came, every hand that might have rested against the wall, every whispered step that faded into silence before it reached the end. You hear nothing but the hum of evening air, the faint groan of wood settling, the soft brush of fabric as it moves along with the gentle draft, the corridor holding the quiet promise of footsteps that will never cross its expanse again. Perhaps someone had run along these floors, a servant carrying plates, a guest hurrying to greet another, the corridor stretching endlessly beneath arches and light. Yet now only the memory of movement lingers, each sound softened, folded gently into the grain of the walls. The air carries faint warmth from where sunlight fell hours before, a trace of fire from the hearth lingering somewhere deeper in the hall, a perfume that rises to greet you softly, a reminder that the corridor has held every breath of anticipation long since vanished. You glance down the length of the hallway, the perspective folding gently into darkness, each door, each shadowed recess, each small column of light reflecting the subtle geometry of time paused, the corridor holding every footstep as though waiting for a moment that never arrives. The carpet's fibers yield softly under your hand when you kneel briefly, pressing fingers against the threads, feeling the warmth and memory woven into each one, the echo of shoes and slippers, the faint press of hands along railings and walls preserved quietly for anyone who notices. A faint scent of wax and polish rises from the floor, mingling with the cooler air drifting from open windows, carrying the perfume of roses from distant gardens, a delicate mix that seems almost tangible, brushing against skin with the softness of memory itself. You imagine the hall alive once, the corridor filled with movement, laughter, and anticipation, the air heavy with the scent of food, flowers, and candlelight, yet now it carries only silence, the kind that holds its breath to preserve the echo of moments that never arrive. Somewhere, far beyond the corridor, the hall waits with its long tables, the guests never appearing, footsteps fading into the dust that lies quietly along polished wood. The corridor, a gentle vessel carrying every missed step and whispered intention to the end of memory. You move slowly toward the open window at the far end, letting the air brush across your face. The faint brush of leaves and stone carrying the scent of evening gardens, the corridor folding quietly around you, preserving the soft trace of every passing step. And when you finally step out into the dusk, the corridor exhales softly behind you, the walls holding the faint echo of footsteps, the air carrying the memory of movement that never fully arrived. A quiet passage folded gently into the world that waits beyond. You walk beneath the low archway that opens into the garden, the air changing as you pass through, cooler now, touched by the faint sweetness of herbs and the soft perfume of flowers breathing in the fading light. A soft gray-blue, brushed with gold, where the last sunlight leans against the horizon, and the trees stand still beneath it, their leaves trembling only when a faint wind decides to wander through. The ground is patterned with shadows falling from trellises wrapped in vines, the wooden beams holding clusters of flowers whose colors have begun to dim in the approaching dusk. petals carrying the day's warmth even as the air begins to cool. You move slowly along the path of smooth stones, each one carrying the faint warmth of sunlight, and you feel it against the thin soles of your shoes, a quiet echo of the day lingering beneath the first threads of evening. The scent here is layered and gentle, roses folding sweetness into the air, while rosemary and thyme release their sharper fragrance when the wind stirs their branches. Every breath you take carrying the memory of hands that once tended this place carefully. The fountain at the center sends its thin streams upward, falling with a rhythm so soft it seems to weave itself into the wind, the water carrying a faint glimmer of reflected light before it slips back into the cool, round basin below. Stone benches curve around the fountain's edge, surfaces worn smooth by time and weather, their pale color glowing faintly in the dimming light, as if the stone itself remembers every evening it has waded through without complaint or question. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a bird calls once and then falls silent, and the sound opens the quiet even wider, the hush deepening as though the air itself were holding its breath to keep from disturbing the stillness growing here. You pause near a cluster of jasmine climbing along a trellis, the flowers small and white, releasing a fragrance so delicate it feels like it might vanish if you breathe too deeply. Yet it lingers softly, as though woven into the very air. The path curves slowly toward the orchard beyond, where trees stand in careful rows, branches heavy with fruit catching the last pale gold of the evening, their scent faintly sweet under the leaves that stir with the wind's slow passing hand, leaving fruit resting where it fell, each one carrying the warmth of sunlight. A narrow table stands near the orchard's edge, its surface bare except for a single cloth folded neatly at one corner. The wood cool and dark beneath the touch of your hand as you pause there, feeling its stillness against your skin. The air carries the faint dampness of approaching night now, earth and leaves releasing their cool fragrance upward, the scent blending with flowers and water until the garden feels wrapped in layers of memory, too quiet to fully name or hold. Lanterns hang unlit along the walls, their glass dull in the fading light, each one holding the faint smell of old smoke and wick, as though they, too, are waiting for someone to come and lift the silence with a small flame. And the air here is cooler, touched by the shadow the wall casts across the grass and pale stone path. A wooden gate rests in the wall, its surface weathered and gray, the hinges streaked faintly with rust, and it stands closed, though not locked, as if the garden wishes to remain untouched by whatever lies beyond its quiet, patient borders. The wind returns briefly, softer now, carrying the rustle of leaves and the faint ripple of water from the fountain, its movement folding through branches, across flowers, over stone and grass, then vanishing again until only stillness remains behind. You sit on one of the curved stone benches, the surface cool beneath you, and the fountain's sound reaches your ears in a rhythm steady and low, as though it were a clock that measures time not by minutes but by falling drops. The first stars appear above the garden wall, pale at first, then slowly brightening against the deepening sky, and their light feels impossibly far yet steady, as though it has been waiting for centuries to spill gently over leaves and water here. You can almost imagine voices drifting through the paths, footsteps on the stones, laughter rising briefly before falling quiet again. but the air holds only the faint scents of flowers, herbs, water, and evening settling slowly across the waiting earth. The orchard beyond the wall is darker now, branches blending together so the fruit gleams faintly where the last light touches them, and the grass carries the smell of coolness rising as night folds slowly over everything the day once held. A moth flutters near one of the lanterns, its pale wings catching what little light remains, moving in uncertain circles as though confused by the glass that offers no flame, before it drifts away toward the darker corners of the garden. You rise and walk once more along the path, stones cool beneath your steps now, the flowers brushing the air with faint perfume, and the fountain whispering softly behind you as though speaking only to itself in the growing night. The baskets beneath the trees remain half-filled, the cloth on the table unmoved, the gate in the wall unopened, everything holding the stillness of a place prepared for more than it received, waiting without impatience or question for what never came. The sky deepens to a darker blue, stars scattering wider above the walls, and the wind stirs only briefly before vanishing again, leaving the garden wrapped in a calm so complete it feels as though even time has paused its slow turning. Your hand brushes the roughness of the wall as you pass back toward the archway, the stone cool and faintly damp now, carrying the weight of evening shadows and the faint scent of ivy where leaves press closely against its surface. The last light clings to the tops of the trees before slipping finally away, leaving only the shapes of branches and the pale curve of the fountain's water where it catches starlight in its falling, rising rhythm that never truly ends. You step through the archway again, carrying the scents of flowers, herbs, water, and cool earth with you, the garden behind holding its silence gently, as though it was always meant to wait through evenings like this, patient and unchanging beneath the stars. You step into the kitchen and immediately feel the warmth lingering from fires long extinguished, the stone hearth cool beneath your palm, yet carrying faint traces of smoke and the subtle sweetness of herbs that drift softly through the air. The countertops are worn smooth, wood polished by decades of careful hands, the faint scent of flour, chopped vegetables, and simmering broths lingering, carrying with it a quiet rhythm of labor that once prepared feasts never claimed by waiting guests. Copper pots hang from hooks above, their surfaces darkened with age, glimmering faintly as sunlight from the small windows falls across them. The scent of old metal and lingering meals brushing against your skin with gentle familiarity. A loaf of bread rests on a wooden board, its crust hardened slightly with time, the faint aroma of yeast and grain curling into the air, delicate and inviting, a soft reminder of nourishment imagined, but never fully shared at a table. Bowls and plates sit stacked carefully along shelves, the surfaces cool beneath your fingers, each one holding the faint warmth of preparation. Traces of touches long gone, folded gently into the curves and edges of ceramic and wood alike. The floor is cool stone beneath your bare feet, each step echoing softly through the room, carrying the memory of hurried movements. The scrape of wooden spoons against pots, the faint rhythm of labor performed in quiet anticipation. Herbs hang from thin ropes above the hearth, drying slowly in the still air, their scents mingling in gentle currents of rosemary, thyme, and sage. The fragrance soft yet insistent, a perfume of memory that drifts through the kitchen like a gentle sigh. You notice a small pile of chopped vegetables on the counter, their color muted with age, the faint scent of carrot and onion still clinging, a quiet echo of hands that worked carefully, slicing and dicing with hope the feast would be enjoyed. The hearth is empty now, coals long cold, yet the scent of wood smoke and faint warmth lingers, as though the fire remembers its purpose, carrying the promise of simmering soups and roasting meats that never found their way to waiting mouths. A kettle sits on the edge of the stove, its surface polished yet cool, the faint metallic scent rising softly, a whisper of water that might have boiled, tea that might have poured, yet now rests only in memory of warmth and ritual. You brush your hand across a countertop and feel the subtle roughness of flour dust, the faint grit that lingers in corners, carrying with it the suggestion of hands moving quickly, measuring, stirring, folding, a quiet choreography that once held promise for a gathering. The windows are small, but let in soft shafts of light that move slowly across the room, catching the copper pots and polished wood, highlighting the faint dust in the air, each particle illuminated like a tiny star hovering in stillness. You imagine someone carrying plates from this kitchen, their hands warm with effort, the faint aroma of herbs and roasting bread trailing behind them, the steps careful and precise along stone floors, yet never reaching the hall where the feast awaited. Spices in small jars line a shelf, their scents gentle and rich, cardamom, nutmeg, and cloves mingling with the air, a quiet memory of warmth, sweetness, and anticipation pressed into the room, as though the kitchen itself breathed gently with its contents. A wooden spoon rests on the edge of a bowl, smooth and darkened with age, the scent of the last mixture faintly clinging, a silent reminder of meals started with care, paused in expectation, and never carried to the tables of eager guests. The drawers beneath the counter are lined with linen, folded neatly and faintly scented with lavender, their fabric soft beneath your fingers, a quiet testimony to preparation, attention, and the small rituals of domestic artistry that time has preserved in gentle memory. You step closer to the hearth, imagining the fire rising again, flames curling softly around pots, the scent of cooking filling the room, each imagined note of food, spice, and bread pressing gently against your senses like a lullaby folded in warmth. The kitchen holds itself still, yet you feel the motion of hands long gone, stirring, lifting, arranging, measuring, the faint echoes of footsteps across stone, the quiet rhythm of preparation, the soft murmur of a world anticipating company that never arrived. You trace your fingers along the edge of a shelf, feeling the grain of wood smooth and warm, the faint impression of hands that have shaped, polished, and maintained this space, each mark carrying a subtle resonance of care, patience, and waiting. The air carries a mixture of warmth and subtle coolness, scents of herbs, old wood, and faint sweetness blending together, as though the kitchen itself breathes, preserving the quiet memory of a feast that ended before the guests arrived, holding it softly against time. And when you finally leave, stepping back into the hall beyond, the kitchen exhales its quiet perfume, the lingering warmth and aroma folding gently into your memory, a soft, invisible gift of preparation preserved even without a single soul to partake of it. You step into the courtyard as evening drifts slowly across the sky, the stones beneath your feet cool and smooth, each one holding the faint warmth of days long past and shadows that linger quietly between them. Fountains stand still, water frozen in memory, the soft scent of moss and wet stone rising faintly, mingling with the sweetness of late-blooming flowers, carrying the echo of a life that once moved through this space with gentle steps. The air is heavy with the quiet hum of evening, a mix of warmth from the stones and the cool caress of wind drifting through arches, brushing your cheek and ruffling leaves in a soft, rhythmic song of calm and patience. Lanterns hang from hooks along the walls, their glass dimmed and dusty, catching the last light of the day, the faint amber glow imagined more than real, illuminating shadows that wait silently like guardians of moments never lived. The benches along the courtyard edges are empty, the wood cool beneath your fingers, iron arms smooth with age, and the scent of sun-warmed stone mingling with lavender and thyme carried softly in the gentle air, folding memory into each surface. A tree stands near the center, its branches wide and low, leaves brushing lightly against the cobblestones, each touch releasing the faint scent of earth and summer rain. A quiet reminder that life and memory can linger even when footsteps never come. You brush past a patch of flowers pressed between stone and soil, their colors muted in the waning light, yet their fragrance soft and insistent, carrying the memory of hands that planted, tended, and hoped for guests who never appeared. The fountain's basin reflects the sky faintly, clouds drifting slowly across its surface, petals and leaves floating gently on water, the movement almost imperceptible, as if the courtyard itself exhales softly, holding every moment in a delicate, suspended balance. You notice shadows stretching along the walls, soft and long, moving subtly with the light, the dark and light blending as if time itself hesitates here, carrying the quiet memory of footsteps that brushed the stones in preparation for a feast that never arrived. Small statues stand at corners, moss clinging to stone, their features softened by years, each one watching the courtyard with quiet patience, their eyes tracing paths that were never walked and waiting for laughter that never rose along these stones. The scent of herbs drifts from small garden beds near the walls, thyme, rosemary, and sage mingling with the faint perfume of roses, carrying a gentle, earthy warmth that reminds you of kitchens, pantries, and hallways already past, threads of memory woven through the night. You run your fingers along the cold surface of a stone bench, feeling the slight unevenness, the roughness softened by rain and sun over seasons. A tactile memory that echoes the careful arrangement of tables, dishes, and guests that never crossed this courtyard. A bird moves faintly among the branches, its wings stirring dust and petals. The sound so soft it seems imagined, yet the subtle movement of air and scent reminds you that even in stillness, life persists in quiet currents through the courtyard. The archways frame the evening sky in gentle curves, the fading light softening edges, the warmth of stones beneath your touch carrying subtle memories of steps that never followed the paths, leaving shadows waiting, patient and unbroken, in quiet anticipation of nothing at all. You feel a breeze lift through the courtyard, curling around walls, brushing leaves and petals against your fingers, carrying the faint scent of summer, stone, and moss, and the faint hum of memory folded into air, a soft, invisible song of presence. The cobblestones are uneven beneath your feet, each one cool and worn, carrying faint impressions of labor and preparation, steps of those who arranged tables, swept floors, and tended gardens for a feast that was intended but never realized. You pause near the fountain, leaning over to watch leaves drift across its surface, each motion slow and deliberate, as if time here stretches to accommodate memory. The courtyard itself breathing gently in rhythm with the sun, wind, and shadowed stones. The lanterns sway faintly in a soft evening breeze, their glass catching last slivers of sunlight, casting gentle patterns of light and shadow across cobblestones, walls, and benches. The courtyard folded in quiet light that seems to linger longer than necessary. You trace a path through the courtyard, fingertips brushing stone and leaf, inhaling the subtle perfume of flowers, herbs, and moss, a delicate aroma that lingers after you, carrying whispers of preparation, anticipation, and quiet patience folded into each corner, each archway, each shadow. And as you step back toward the doorway that leads to hallways and kitchens, the courtyard exhales softly, holding its quiet stillness, shadows waiting patiently, light and memory folded gently together, keeping the echo of footsteps that never came alive in subtle, eternal calm. You walk slowly through the echoing hall, where silver platters still carry the memory of fruits now bruised by time. The air fragrant with fading sweetness, as though the walls themselves are reluctant to release the last traces of celebration. The curtains stir faintly in a breath of wind too delicate to feel, the tall windows drinking the last embers of evening light as the horizon turns from amber to violet, the colors folding softly like layers of silk being drawn away. You can almost hear the murmur of voices that never came, chairs waiting with patient backs curved like old friends leaning toward one another. The table long enough to hold conversations that never began, yet carrying the promise of laughter unshaken. The floor beneath your steps keeps its polished sheen, though leaves from the courtyard have blown across its surface, curled and brittle, as though autumn itself had wandered inside hoping for warmth and found only the echo of a gathering undone. Your hand drifts along the edge of the table, feeling the linen smooth yet cool beneath your fingers. The embroidered vines stitched with such care appearing dim now under the soft glow of dwindling candles, standing in silver cups half filled with wax. The musicians' stands remain in one corner, silent, with bows resting against chairs where no hands reached for strings, the memory of melodies unplayed clinging faintly as though the notes hovered just out of hearing, waiting for a breath to awaken them. You pause near the hearth where the fire once promised warmth, yet holds only pale ash, now its gray curls carrying the faint scent of wood long burned, a scent that settles in the mind like old stories murmured by forgotten voices. The air itself carries a stillness so complete it feels tender rather than empty, like the pause after rain before the first bird dares to sing, the kind of silence that asks nothing except to be kept unbroken for a little longer. Through the high windows, the moon rises slowly, pale and round, casting a silver trail along the table's length so every goblet catches its light, turning still water into shards of quiet radiance untouched by lips that never arrived to claim them. You remember the hours before dusk, when the kitchen doors swung open with arms carrying trays heavy with bread warm enough to mist the air. Each loaf, a cloud of fragrance promising hunger, would meet its end beneath lamplight and company. The garden beyond the courtyard now sleeps under its own shadows, roses folding inward as though to keep the night from sipping their perfume. The paths empty, except for the occasional moth drifting like a scrap of parchment across the lantern glow. Somewhere along the colonnade, a door moves slightly on its hinges with a sigh softer than breath, as though the house itself tries to speak but thinks better of it, settling again into the patient dignity of stone and timber waiting together. You think of the invitations written in careful hands, each letter curved like a promise across paper sealed with wax, still unbroken in pockets, never reaching the gate, and wonder if the words now sleep beside unread letters on distant tables. The servants have gone, their footsteps faded down long corridors, leaving dishes stacked like porcelain towers beside basins where water cools in silence. The steam gone, only the faint ring of metal settling into itself after a day that emptied too soon. You picture the guests moving through lamplit streets somewhere far beyond, perhaps pausing at bridges or waiting under trees while the wind tangled itself in their sleeves, never knowing the doors here closed before their shadows could cross the threshold. The candles near the doorway lean slightly as though tired, their flames bowing low, drops of wax frozen like tears at their bases. The scent of smoke weaving upward in a thread so thin it seems stitched to the dark itself. You sit at the long table alone, listening to the room breathe faintly through rafters and draped curtains, the night pressing close yet gentle, as though even the stars have gathered at the windows to wonder why no voices rose tonight. The dishes wait in polished ranks, fruit dulled, bread cooling into silence, bowls glimmering with reflections of moonlight that slip like silver fish across their surfaces. The whole hall, a tide gone out, leaving shells of celebration along its floor. You think of how quickly warmth escapes once the fire dips low, how bread loses its softness, how wine turns flat without laughter rising around it, how even music waits for footsteps to give it permission to lift itself into air. The evening stretches, now like fabric drawn thin over the frame of hours, the feast shrinking not from neglect but from time itself, folding carefully as it always does, carrying moments away like leaves gathered into unseen baskets of wind. You sense the house knows this ending well, has watched other nights fade in lamplight, other fires sink into ash, other tables return to wood and linen without the weight of voices leaning across them in warmth and shared hunger. Outside, the fountain still spills water into its wide stone bowl, the sound drifting faintly through open windows, a reminder that some things move without audience, without witness, without needing anyone to turn toward them with applause or astonishment or thanks. You rise slowly, trailing fingers along chairbacks as you walk toward the doors, the hall behind you stretching its quiet, like a quilt being shaken gently before folding itself back into the chest of memory where such nights eventually belong. The last candle near the doorway bends its flame as you pass, the small light bowing as though in courtesy, smoke curling behind it like the tail of a letter written in ink that disappears before the eyes can finish reading. In the courtyard, the air feels cooler, the stones beneath your feet giving back the warmth they held all day in a faint hush, like hands opening slowly after keeping something safe until the moment came to let it go. The moon follows you along the path toward the gate, a pale companion who says nothing, yet makes the road ahead glimmer faintly as though dusted with chalk, each stone carrying its own silver echo beneath your quiet footsteps. Somewhere an owl turns its head slowly on a branch you cannot see, feathers blending into the bark, its gaze folding the night into deeper silence, as though your passing has been marked with a nod rather than a cry. You pause once more before the gate, the hall behind you now dim except for a few tired flames, the scent of bread and wood smoke drifting faintly after you like the hem of a garment worn by someone who never speaks. The feast has ended, the guests have not come, yet the night itself feels neither scornful nor empty, only certain in its way of moving forward, carrying even this unfinished gathering into the soft archives where hours go when they are done. You close the gate slowly, feeling its iron cool beneath your palms, the hinges whispering in their old voices, and as it latches behind you, the sound seems less like finality than like pages turning somewhere just beyond hearing in the dark. The path ahead leans into the distance with quiet patience, the wind weaving its faint threads along hedges and low walls, and you walk on knowing the story belongs now to the night itself, which keeps such endings without judgment or haste. You return once more to the hall before leaving entirely, as though some part of you cannot bear to let it end without looking again at what remains, the air still warm with the last breaths of candles burning low. The moonlight falls differently now across the table, slanting through tall windows in wide silver ribbons, touching the untouched plates as though curious to see what feast was promised and why it ended before any voices filled the room. You trace the edge of the tablecloth with fingertips softened by evening air, feeling the faint coolness where earlier there was warmth, the fabric now holding only the ghost of heat from dishes carried away to kitchens grown silent as stone. The bread has hardened on its platter, though no hand broke it, its crust pale in the lamplight, as though it, too, waited for laughter to wake it before stiffening into something more memory than promise, more shadow than sustenance. Wine in crystal glasses leans into stillness, dark surfaces holding the reflection of candles grown weary, their flames trembling toward smoke. The liquid inside never shared, yet glowing faintly like ink waiting for words no longer needed to be spoken. You listen for footsteps that never come, for the sound of doors swinging wide, for the long sweep of garments moving through air, yet the night holds its breath the way snow does before falling, a quiet too complete to break. The chairs stand ready around the table, as though keeping their posture out of duty, each one curved like a question mark left unanswered, backs polished by hands from other nights when the air here carried warmth enough to rise upward. Even the walls seem to lean inward, as though they, too, wonder what became of the gathering they were promised, their tapestries heavy with centuries of listening yet tonight given nothing but the faint crackle of cooling hearthstones turning to ash. You cross to the windows where the garden lies in shadow, roses sleeping with petals folded tight, the fountain spilling water for no one, its silver thread glinting faintly under the moon, as though it keeps time for itself alone. Somewhere beyond the orchard, an owl calls once, the sound gliding low over grass, still carrying the warmth of day, its cry less mournful than patient, as though it has seen such nights before and expects little from the hour ahead. You think of the invitations written with care, each name curved in ink, steady as candlelight, letters folded, sealed, sent into distance where perhaps weather or chance kept them from reaching the hands meant to hold them toward this waiting door. The servants left quietly, their footsteps trailing away like a tide drawing back, voices fading into the hush of corridors where lanterns burn low. leaving behind only the faint scent of herbs and flower clinging to aprons now folded for dawn. You lift one of the silver covers left behind, its surface cool and bright, yet empty beneath, as though the absence beneath the lid matters more than what was once meant to rest there, fragrant and warm enough to fill the air. Outside, the courtyard sleeps under branches that stir faintly though no wind moves, the hedges holding their shape like dark walls, the cobblestones glimmering where moonlight rests in puddles left by yesterday's rain slowly sinking into soil made soft by roots below. You imagine the guests turning back along unlit roads, carriages rocking slowly through stretches of fields where crickets call unseen, perhaps pausing at rivers where the sky leans down to drink, their faces unreadable in the dim light carried beside them. The musicians left their instruments waiting in velvet cases, strings unwarmed, bows unrosened, the silence heavier for their absence, as though even the air near the rafters remembers other nights when music moved like soft wind across polished wood and glass. The hearth holds no flame now, only ash faintly warm at its heart, the stones breathing out the last heat in small sighs, as though the fire tried to stay awake, but drifted the way all things do when hours grow long. You walk slowly across the room once more, every step stirring the smallest echoes from floorboards that keep the memory of boots, slippers, heels, the whole history of feet moving toward warmth and company. Tonight, carrying only the hush of your own, the table waits beneath its linen cover, like a stage where actors never arrived. Plates arranged in patient rows, napkins folded with the dignity of monks at prayer, goblets gathering moonlight where wine should have caught lamplight and laughter instead. You pause by the door with its iron latch cool beneath your hand, thinking of the gate at the edge of the orchard, the one no wheel touched tonight, no shadow crossed, though the lantern there burned all evening just the same. The house itself seems to exhale as you turn, timbers settling softly, rafters giving small murmurs like someone shifting in sleep, its whole frame holding centuries of evenings, both full and empty. Tonight, only another layer added to its long remembering. You picture the kitchen now with its hearth embers dull, copper pots hanging motionless, the long table there wiped clean though carrying the faint smell of rosemary and thyme, the kind of fragrance that lingers long after warmth itself has gone. Beyond the courtyard, the orchard leans toward the hills silvered by moonlight, the grass bending faintly under creatures passing low and quiet, night holding all of it together with a stillness wide enough to make even stars seem deliberate in their watching. You step outside at last, the night folding around your shoulders, cool as water, the scent of earth rising faintly where leaves fall damp beneath trees, the air carrying that mixture of soil and blossom and distance found only in late hours. The gate waits ahead with its hinges dark from rain and years, the iron curved in patterns made for beauty rather than defense, the latch worn smooth where countless hands closed it against wind, against weather, against endings that come without ceremony. You turn once more to the house behind you, windows dim now except for one near the stair where a single candle burns low, its flame leaning left as though listening to the orchard wind passing soft as breath along the walls. The feast has ended, though no voices rose, no glasses touched, no bread broke, yet the night carries it gently, the way rivers carry petals fallen from trees, not in haste, not in sorrow, Only in the quiet way hours move on. You close the gate with a sound barely louder than the rustle of leaves along the path. The latch settling in place like a sentence ending softly rather than sharply. The kind of ending that leaves space for echoes rather than silence. The road beyond stretches, pale beneath the moon, dust rising faintly where your steps disturb it. The air cooler now, with each bend of wind through hedges, as though the world folds inward slowly after each gathering, no matter how small. You walk, knowing the story belongs to the night now, carried away like pollen on currents unseen, scattered across fields and rooftops where dreams wait open-handed, ready to gather whatever drifts near as sleep leans gently across the earth. The house grows smaller behind you, its windows like tired eyes half closing, the orchard swallowing its walls in branches, the sky bending low enough for stars to rest along its roof, the whole place returning to the quiet it held before candles. Somewhere, water keeps moving through the fountain, unseen now. Its voice, low and patient, a reminder that some things go on whether witnessed or not, carrying silver threads through darkness toward places that do not ask what was missed or why. The path ahead turns pale under starlight as you walk farther, the fields leaning into distance with their soft breathing of grass. The night carrying you the way sleep carries thoughts away from themselves into places where stories settle like dust. And when the gate and the house are long behind, when even the orchard fades into dark, stitched only by the smallest lamps of fireflies, you feel the night itself fold you in, as though keeping this ending safe within its own keeping. No voices come, no wheels turn, no lamps flare along the road ahead, only the slow air of fields moving under stars. The kind of quiet that holds you steady until dreams themselves arrive like long-awaited guests crossing the last distance home.